Good morning. When I was in seminary facing the Ministerial Fellowship Committee about 13 years ago, a credentialing body of the Unitarian Universalist Association consisting of a panel of seasoned ministers, each of whom was recognized as an expert in a particular area of ministry. I was so nervous about the history portion of that interview. Even after years of intensive study, I had a hard time understanding how Unitarian Universalism evolved and how it ended up becoming what it became, which is so very different from how it started off. I didn't even know how to talk about Unitarian Universalism or my commitment to it. And I certainly didn't know how to prepare for being grilled on that jumble of names and dates and facts and geographies. I was truly terrified. And so I decided to start with what I could recognize as Unitarian Universalist values, those reflected in our 7 principles, as well as those that I've observed in terms of how we do things, what we do, how we do things as a denomination and as individual congregations. So I want to start just by hearing from you, what are some key values that you recognize? If you just raise your hand and call it out. What's a value? Yes.
Respect.
Respect, yes.
Connectedness.
Connectedness.
Compassion.
Compassion.
Inclusiveness.
Inclusiveness. Diverse.
Integrity.
Integrity.
Self-responsibility.
Self-responsibility.
Reason.
Welcoming.
Humility.
Honesty. Humility.
Democracy.
Multitasking. Democracy. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So here's a slide of some of the values that I saw when I was doing this for the first time. These were some of the values that I recognized in our principles. Some of them are the same as the ones that you've mentioned. By the end of this hour, I'm hoping that we will have affirmed all of these values and have recognized them as rooted in our history. I'd like to do this in such a way that hopefully by the end of this hour, we will all feel a bit more comfortable claiming these values and talking about Unitarian Universalism with anyone, expert or not. So let's start by continuing this little exercise. Now we've just named some values. I'd like to ask you to call out one-word responses to something that you've observed about Unitarian Universalism or something that you have a question about. So for example, you may have observed that we have a chalice. So call out the word chalice. And Dave is going to repeat what you call out so everybody can hear, and I'm going to write them down.
So one more time. Call out. Chalice. Chalice.
Covenant.
Covenant.
Principles.
Principles. Knowledge. Knowledge.
Liberal.
Liberal.
Inclusive.
Okay, we have 2 there, so we have inclusive and thoughtful.
Inquiry.
Inquiry.
Music.
I missed that. What was it?
Welcoming.
Welcoming, and there was one other one I missed.
She got music.
Music. And let's hear 1 or 2 more.
Openness.
Openness.
Activist.
Excellence.
Activist.
Activism.
I like that combination, actually. Excellent activism.
And that one goes on the small switch.
Okay, thank you very much. So these are just a few, and I want to touch on them very quickly. In this context, liberal doesn't relate necessarily to political position. Liberal in a religious context means diverse, meaning that there are many different ways that we express our theology, our spirituality. So that's what that means in this context when we talk about this being a liberal religious tradition. Covenant is a really important one, because in other religious traditions, in many other religious traditions, the community is bound by a creed. And a creed is a statement of faith created by someone else and handed down. It's top down. The thing about a covenant is that it's created by the people. So everyone here participates in the creation of it and is free to buy into it or not. So that's a really important thing. We are bound here by covenant. The chalice, well, we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. Activism. Activism is a really important part of Unitarian Universalist history, and we're going to talk a little bit later about where those roots are. But clearly we can see in the last century, in the last many decades, Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have been on the cutting edge of many of our justice issues: environmental justice, human rights, economic justice, all different kinds of things. So we'll talk about that as well. The principles are really important because, again, we're not bound by commandments. Our behavior is not determined by commandments that were handed down from above. We have 7 principles that the Unitarians and the Universalist communities created together as a way to say, okay, these are the most basic things that we are going to lift up, that we are going to affirm about human nature and about human potential. So that's not the same as a creed, because you don't necessarily have to believe it, but you are expected to wrestle with it, to see how those things make sense in your life and in the decisions that you make in your life. What's important to know about the principles also is that we have 7, but we didn't start with 7, we started with 6. And they do get reviewed and revised every few years. And actually right now, the Unitarian Universalist Association, which we probably also want to put up here, is in the process of reviewing them and revising them, because Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. And that means we're constantly reflecting on what we've learned, reflecting on what's going on in the world today, how does that apply to the world today. And so our theology changes. As we learn and grow, our theology changes. And so the principles, when they were originally written, the language reflected the times. And then in the 1980s, as the feminist movement came about, people were saying, you know, we need to find more inclusive language. We need to make this more reflective of what's going on today. Right now, they're reviewing the principles again, because we're actually looking at the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, which is our first principle, and we're looking at whether or not to expand that, to go beyond the human-centric emphasis, to think about all of creation. So we learn, we grow, we change, and that's why we are a living tradition. There are a couple of other things that I want to briefly mention before we go on. When I've done this in the past, some folks have asked about OWL. That was one of the words up there. OWL is a human sexuality program that is very important in Unitarian Universalism because it links our values with sexuality. It doesn't keep it separate. We recognize the wholeness of our human experience. There's no part of human experience that is bad or not to be spoken of. So our OWL program is that, and if you have any questions about that, Davidson is the one to talk to. He's sitting here in the second row. Another question is, are you free to believe or do anything you want to hear? The answer is no. Our principles are actually kind of vague on purpose. They leave room for each person to actively wrestle with them. They are not commandments, but they do point to some very specific values, and that's what we need to stay focused on. If God isn't central in Unitarian Universalism, is Unitarian Universalism still a religion? Well, not every religion has God as central. And we would also need to have a conversation about what you mean by God, because there are lots of different ways to think about that. Let's see, we'll move on to something else. The difference between a fellowship and a church. This is the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Redwood City. How is that different from the Unitarian Universalist Church of whatever? Historically, fellowships are lay-led. Many of them started in rural areas where they didn't have professional ministers, and so they grew from the ground up. And this fellowship has that history, has that tradition, but has since moved into a different kind of ministry. So the name is still fellowship, but we function a little bit more like a church at this point. Why is activism activism such an important part of Unitarian Universalist identity? Why is it seen as a spiritual practice and a moral imperative? The main reason, I think, is because Unitarian Universalism doesn't focus on God or heaven or what happens after you die. It focuses on the here and now. It focuses on the earth and the experiences of hell that people have while they're here. Unitarian Universalism focuses on the human power to make a difference. And so that's one of the reasons why activism is linked with our spiritual practice here. Membership requirements. One of the requirements is a UU history session like this one. So you're well on your way if that's something you're interested in. We also have an orientation, which we hoped to have after the service today. We're going to reschedule that. Once you choose or you think you're getting close to membership, I invite people to come and meet with me so I can get to know you a little better. You can get to know me. We can maybe answer some questions that you might have. Then you might sign the book and share a covenant, either privately or publicly, and it's a covenant that we all share. Once you are a member, there is a requirement to give of your time and of your financial resources, to volunteer, to make honoring a responsible annual pledge, and to keep your covenant, to keep the covenant that we share here. One of the other questions that has been asked of me is, how many UUs does it take to change a light bulb? So there are lots of answers to this, as you might imagine. Some of them are not fit for sharing in mixed company. But the joke is, one of the jokes is that it takes dozens. Because first you have to form a committee to talk about whether it needs to be changed, and then you have to talk about who's responsible and who's accountable and who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. So Unitarian Universalism, no, that's not really true. We get things done here. Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. It is deeply rooted and ever growing like a tree. So it started small, like a little acorn. It grew big. It reacts to all the seasons, the rainy seasons, the dry seasons, and it is a beautiful thing to behold. Unitarian Universalism is what it is today because of what you bring to it. It matters that you're here, and that can't be said often enough. It matters not only because of its roots in history, but because of what each generation brings to it in terms of insights and critical thinking, in terms of questions and care and creative collaboration, reason and risk. So for today, I'd like us all to think about us, to think about everyone here as the leafy, green, protective, productive foliage, the living leaves that keep this liberal religious tree alive, making it a sanctuary, a place of healing and hope and inspiration and courage to so many. Thank you for being here today. But I decided to stop at about 2,000 years. What I wanted to talk to the children about was the influence of two primary roots, and one is the ancient Greek, the Hellenistic, and one is the Hebrew. So let's start with the ancient Greek. The ancient Greeks were famous for many things, among them the following: the right to ask questions, to not just accept anything that anybody tells you. So that connects with freedom as a value, the freedom to use our minds. They also talked about lifting up and celebrating human beings, our bodies, our minds, our potential to learn and grow and do amazing things. That connects, in my mind, to the value of compassion and equity and respect. There's also the insistence that everyone should have a voice in their government through a democratic process. Now, back in the days, it was only free rich men who got to vote, but it was a start. Again, the value connected here is equality. Freedom linked with responsibility. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see the next slide, the Judaic tradition. Many Unitarian Universalist values we recognize today can also be traced back to the Jewish tradition. The idea of treating the earth, treating creation as sacred. The ability to study, to learn, to believe in our unity under God, that we are all equal. The ability to think for yourself, to argue with God, to question things. The requirement to be of service to others, to be generous, to do justice, to focus on supporting and celebrating life as we know it, instead of worrying or fighting about what happens after we die. That sounds familiar too, doesn't it? When Jesus was born, these were the ideas that were most common. His teachings combined these. Jesus asked people to put aside differences and live in peace, and that was a pretty radical thing to do back then, and probably even today. His teachings can be represented by that place on the tree where the roots start coming together, forming a trunk. So the thing that's important to remember is that Jesus was born and lived and died as a Jew. The idea of a separate religion called Christianity didn't start until long after his death. We now know that for the first many years after his death, people spent a lot of time and energy trying to remember what was it that he said and write it down. Trying to remember what he said, to write it down and try to interpret it, try to figure out what it all meant. So in terms of the early Christian communities, they put together these writings called Gospels, and they were copied and edited and recopied, and within a very short period of time, they became incredibly popular. And given that they didn't have TV or the internet, that's really quite amazing. Each Christian community interpreted these Gospels in different ways. So there was a lot of diversity in terms of how to be a follower of Jesus, what it was you were supposed to believe, or how you were supposed to act. As far as we can tell, what all of these communities had in common was faith in Jesus' teaching that all people are equal, that God is loving and wants us to be loving, that we all have something special inside us, the power of God inside us, and that only God should be obeyed and worshipped, not the king and not money. Modern Unitarian Universalists don't talk very much about this part of our history, but it's really quite important. All of this was exciting to people back then who had been under the control of the Roman government. But of course, this was threatening to those who were in power. And as so often happens, those in power started persecuting the minority, the Christian communities. Made life really hard for them for those first several hundred years after Jesus' death. They did all kinds of horrible things to his followers, but there was something so powerful in his message that it gave people courage and faith and hope. Like an acorn, that message was like a seed, sprouting and taking root in those Christian communities. So that's something that I think is incredibly important to remember, and I hope to have a chance to share that with the children at another time. Expected to that death, that they grew in number, even as they were persecuted, tortured, and killed. The unification of those diverse communities and theologies is attributed to Emperor Constantine, who lived in from 306 to 337 Christian era. His motivation may have been mixed, partly because his mother Helena had converted to Christianity, but mostly, I believe, because he recognized that unifying these communities would consolidate and strengthen his own power, give him a big advantage, a huge advantage. In 313, he decriminalized Christianity, giving Christians legal rights for the first time. Then Christianity became the official state religion through the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, and all of this sounded really great, sounded really benevolent. But what this did was make him the emperor, make him the central power of the church, and that's something Jesus most likely never anticipated or wanted. In the time between those two developments, Constantine rallied the theological troops. He called councils. The councils were charged with collecting and sorting through all of the Christian writings, all of the Gospels, and there were dozens of them at least. He wanted them to determine which of those Gospels, which of those writings would best allow him to manage the people. Can anybody name the 4 Gospels that we ended up with? Did I hear John, Paul, George, and Ringo?
Matthew, Mark, and John.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yes, thank you. So these were written decades death. The councils also argued the fine points of Christian theology, debating specifically the nature of God. Is God human or divine or a unique combination? After much debate, the councils decided. They defined and refined what was to become the one and only way, the state-sanctioned way to be Christian. They set doctrine, infallible and in stone. One of the key moments in that part of our history, something that I was actually tested on and knew I would be, is the Arian controversy. So the Arian controversy centers on two key figures, Bishop Athanasius and Arius. Bishop Athanasius argued for the Trinity, the idea that God is actually three things, God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, all rolled up into one. Arius argued against that, because he said that there's actually nothing in Jesus' teachings to substantiate this. So Arius' perspective had gotten a lot of traction among the thinking people, but he ended up losing the argument. So Trinitarian Christianity became official, and anyone who questioned or denied it became a heretic. Unitarianism, as an understanding of the nature of God, of ultimate reality, went underground at that point for centuries. The important thing to remember is that there was a lot of diversity in those early Christian communities. There were a lot of different ways to be Christian. As a result of Constantine's hunger for power, doctrine was set. To be Christian, you had to affirm the Trinity and the Creed, no variations if you didn't want to get burned at the stake. And Scripture was set. All those other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which affirmed the light of God within each and every one of us, they were condemned as blasphemous. And this was the beginning of the Catholic Church, the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church that linked church and state in power for over at least 1,000 years after that. So as the church took hold, as its power took hold and the Roman Empire collapsed in 476, Europe was thrown into what is now known as the Dark Ages, in which critical thinking was lost and power was held in the few, in the hands of the few. Does that sound familiar at all? In the years to follow, as the state took ever more control, its actions became increasingly less Christian in nature, more destructive, evil. The Crusades were clearly a bloodbath, fueled more by the desire to acquire new properties and power than to spread God's love. The church got richer, the people got poorer, it was chaotic, and as usually happens when you reach a tipping point in the balance of power, something had to give. So two things we now know helped disrupt that system of evil, helped split the trunk of that tree. The printing press and the discovery of the Americas. The printing press allowed lay people to read sacred texts themselves for the very first time, instead of having somebody else interpret them for them. For the first time, they didn't need a priest. They could meet with each other, they could read for themselves, use their own minds, pray the words that were in their hearts. The discovery of the Americas fired the imagination of people, making them think outside the box, beyond the boundaries of their individual experience of the ruling forces, and even beyond their religious and national allegiance. For the first time in a very long time, people imagined religious freedom and were willing to fight for it, and even to die for it. The Protestant Reformation was a time of great societal, political, theological upheaval, much like today. All the old beliefs were called into question, and new theories were being developed and discussed and tested, and there was bloodshed on all sides. And there were mass migrations, as free thinkers fled from one area to another seeking safety, but bringing with them their revolutionary new ideas. There was a lot of religious and political unrest and cross-pollination. The tree at that point split into many different branches, each one representing some new innovation, some nuance of religious belief the people who were most influential in what ultimately became Unitarianism and Universalism are on the next slide. We already heard about Jan Hus, the predecessor to the Reformation, the seed planter who was burned at the stake. There was Martin Luther, who published a list of 95 complaints against the church in 1517. He advocated, according to, for conscience, the use of conscience, that there should be no middleman, that there should be no indulgences. And he was the one to translate the Bible into the vernacular. John Calvin, well, he was responsible for the doctrine of predestination, which said that God decides in advance who's damned to hell and who's going to heaven, so it doesn't really matter what you do because he's already decided. Well, the people who had a different perspective, who had a universalist perspective, they arose in reaction to this, and universalism comes from that, a rebellion against that idea that we are that powerless. Universalism has to do with the idea that we all have the opportunity while we're alive to choose well, to do justice, to be the best that we can be. Some of those who moved things along more directly were Michael Servetus, who published a treatise called On the Errors of Trinity. He was pro-Unitarian, and he argued with Calvin and was burned at the stake. Francis David in Transylvania is known as the father of the Unitarian Church there, and he promoted the Universalist focus of the transformative power of love. We also had a Unitarian king. Did anybody know that? King John Sigismund, the one and only so far Unitarian king. One of the things he's well known for is guaranteeing religious freedom. He was the first one to say, let's just all see if we can get along together. The Protestant Reformation arose in response to the corruptions of the church, the unjust sufferings of the people, and a rising appreciation for the fact that humans are and should be equal under God and must be free to think for themselves. People must be free from the dictates of the state. We must be able to connect with and answer to a higher power. The mass migrations that took place as people fled persecution, fled violence, and spread these innovations, these ideals about freedom, spread them far and wide, meant again that there was a lot of cross-pollination. And one of the things I want to mention that's not often mentioned is the influence of Islam on the development of Unitarian Universalism. Because after the fall of the Roman Empire, Islam became the center of literacy and scientific exploration. It was well established in many parts of Europe, including Spain, which for a very long time was known for the coexistence of many different communities, including the Jewish community as well. Islam was a harbor for radical inclusivity with its focus on freedom and peace and equality and unity under God. And those were ideals that the persecuted Christians, the Reformed Christians, could very much relate to. Now, I mentioned again that the Protestant Reformation split that trunk of the tree into many branches, but we're just going to focus on the Unitarian branch and the Universalist branch. Unitarians believed that Jesus was separate from and less than God, as well as possibly a bit more than just human. But the status quo, that was blasphemous, and therefore it was dangerous. So many of them sought to flee to the American colonies, which again sparked the imagination of those seeking religious freedom. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, I think. Because one of the innovations that can be most directly traced to Unitarian Universalist identity today, to the way that we do things, is the Mayflower Compact, which was the first governing document of the Plymouth colony, created by religious separatists later known as Pilgrim Fathers, who fled the control of the king in order to pursue religious freedom here. Well, one of the first things they did, we are told, when they arrived in 1620, in celebration of their freedom from external rule, was to create a covenant, a statement of intention articulating how they would be in relationship with each other and with God in this new place. And to this day, our congregations are unified by freely affirmed covenant, not by an externally imposed creed. The other innovation was the Cambridge Platform of 1648, which affirmed the right of a community in Dedham, Massachusetts, to be self-governing, to elect its own minister, to raise its own funds, to determine its own policy. That was completely new. The idea that congregations could be free not only to determine the spirit of their union, but also the practical organizational elements. That's called congregational polity. And it's one of the most treasured aspects of our congregational life today, because what it means is that our members are the ones who grow our communities. You're the ones, your participation, your volunteering, and your financial support, and everything else help make this the place it is. And if you visited a few other Unitarian Universalist congregations, you may have noticed that they're all a little different. They each have their own culture and their own way of doing things. So congregational polity has to do with our historic commitment to religious freedom, to the separation of church and state. And one of the benefits of not being tied to the state anymore is that now, here, we have freedom of the pulpit. And that means that we get to speak our conscience to a point. And this is where it gets tricky. Since we claim a non-profit status, we are legally bound to assure that our communities do not do anything to unduly influence the local or state or national election process. And that's a really fine line to walk. Because what if the election process itself is deemed defective or immoral? What then? I can tell you the call to live up to our ethical ideals while subject to laws that may seek to render them silent can easily lead to a crisis of conscience. A real headache. Especially when, as is the case during this election, so much is at stake. When emotions are so high, and we run the risk not only of breaking the law, but also, depending on when and where and how we talk about all of this, we run the risk of stepping out of our covenant with one another. A covenant that calls us to make this a space in which all can be welcome, feel safe and respected enough to cultivate the kinds of personal relationships of trust and care in which to wrestle most productively, most effectively with issues of conscience. Ironically, it is the bond of our freely chosen covenant that gives us the freedom needed to do just that. And if there's nothing else you take from this today, please take that. But there is more. Joseph Priestley is a name that we want to remember because he was the first Unitarian to arrive in the Americas in 1791. We've had 4 Unitarian presidents, at least, if you don't count President Obama, whose grandmother was Unitarian. And there were many movers and shakers who were Unitarian, and you've had some of them printed in your order of service. Now, the Universalist branch. The Universalist movement is firmly rooted in those early egalitarian, anti-establishment, beloved Christian communities. Universalism came to the Americas via what we like to call our little miracle. Because a Universalist preacher named John Murray set sail from England and was shipwrecked in New Jersey in the late 18th century, losing both his wife and his daughter. And when he arrived, completely broken-hearted and desolate, he met a man named Thomas Potter, who had actually built a chapel on his property and was waiting for just the right preacher to come along to fill it with words of God's love. And so that was John Murray. And he went on to found the first Universalist church in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which I visited this past summer. The Universalists were officially recognized as an organization in 1793, and some of the names you might remember are Thomas Starr King, Clara Barton, who started the American Red Cross, Olympia Brown, and even Ray Bradbury, I heard, was Universalist. Today, many of our congregations that started out as Universalist, even if they've moved on theologically, are adorned with crosses and stained glass windows of Jesus on the Mount and baptismal fonts, which can be a little surprising if you're not expecting that. Unitarianism and Universalism both grew out of the Protestant Reformation, but they developed very differently. And those differences point to, among other things, certain class issues that we continue to see today. So the Unitarian branch developed mostly in urban areas on the East Coast, and most of their congregations were led by male ministers who had been educated at Harvard. The Universalists, on the other hand, were mostly in rural areas, mostly in the Midwest, and led by women ministers. So they had a very different flavor. The Unitarians focused on the rights of individuals to think and act freely, the right of conscience. The Universalists focused on the personal relationship between individuals and their God, and the way that relationship is reflected in their relationships with each other. So they pointed more to interdependence as a core thing. The tagline for the Unitarians was, "We are too good to be damned," and the Universalists said, "As God is too good to ever damn us." So the idea of bringing together these two very distinct denominations grew over time, and it had a lot of different influences. A lot of things led to that, politically, philosophically, scientifically. A few I want to mention are the Enlightenment, right? So there were all kinds of new developments in terms of our intellectual life, how we think about things, our philosophy, scientific advances and discoveries. Darwin's theory of evolution rocked their world back in those days. The other was the Civil War, because the Civil War touched every single family. Every family suffered horrendous loss and bloodshed, and the most natural thing in the world is for people, when they experience something like that, to start questioning that God, who's supposed to be looking out for us. So there was a tremendous loss of faith in all denominations in this country, a rise of secularism, and a decline in religious membership. The other thing that happened was the availability of Eastern texts, scriptures. For the first time, people had access to Eastern scriptures, realizing that there are actually lots of different ways to make sense of the world. Another was the German Jewish Reform movement. In the latter part of the 19th century, a lot of German Jews started emigrating to the United States and bringing their reform energy with them, again, pollinating us here in this country. So in the latter half of the 19th century, many American religious communities were struggling. Many denominations started talking about merger as a way to help them survive, or they had to shut their doors. In the 20th century, theology continued to shift away from Christianity, away from a benevolent God, toward much greater theological diversity, including agnosticism and atheism. 2 world wars contributed to a decline in faith. Humanism was on the rise, and it became clear that religious identity had to be about more than our beliefs. It had to be about action. And we already talked a little bit about the Unitarian Service Committee rising at that time. Over the course of decades, Unitarians, on the one hand, Universalists on the other, gathered to consider their options, either close their doors or find some way to survive. So they started talking about merging with each other, what it would mean to merge these two distinct traditions, what would be gained, what would be lost. And the first important thing to do was to try to figure out what do they have in common. And our principles came out of those discussions, which again, they're kind of vague, but they work. Once that step was taken and we had our principles, the merger could happen. And that happened in, does anybody know the year? 1961, the year of my birth. As a denomination, we have been learning and growing and challenging norms, taking risks, not only carrying forward those original values that we trace from the Greek and Hebrew traditions, but uncovering ever deeper meanings of what it is to be in right relationship with those values and with life itself, with one another, with this earth, with the past and future generations. The principles and sources have been revised several times, and they're under review again right now. Since merger, Unitarian Universalists have been on the front lines of the civil rights movement, advocating for peace, for gay rights, for women's rights, indigenous rights, for racial justice, marriage, equality, universal health care, anti-trafficking, just wages, water justice, environmental justice. Most recently, many congregations have chosen to take a stand on behalf of all Black Lives Matter movement. We're doing a lot in the world. We are making a difference in the world. What I learned in using this tree image is that Unitarian Universalism is not a flash in the pan, and it is not a cult, as some people like to say. It is a religion with very deep roots, and it doesn't generally focus on those roots, because the central idea of Unitarian Universalism is for each of us to carry those timeless values forward in a way that is relevant to the times, to the now, to the here and now, so that through our lives, freedom is merged with responsibility and becomes ethical action. So we're getting close to the end here, and I just want to say Unitarian Universalism is not for everyone. That is very clear to me. It can be really hard to recognize how all of this diversity can coexist in a productive, spiritually satisfying way. It can be particularly difficult when faced with life's most painful mysteries to not be given easy answers or absolution. To have to take on responsibility for our own beliefs and actions, risk sharing what we've experienced, what we've learned so far of ultimate meaning and value. We do our best to make room for all of that, guiding each other back to those shared values and our covenant, but it's not always a smooth process. As I've come to understand it, Unitarian Universalism is a unique, empowering combination of head and heart and hands. A combination of everything that's going on in the world today, all of those realities, all of those challenges, as well as the realities of our individual lives and all their precious and flawed and painful and mundane magnificence. So when I see that flame in our chalice, I am reminded of the creative potential that we each bring to this life. I'm reminded of transformation, of change, of love as the only constant, the only real power. I'm reminded of how much we need each other in order to bring more light into the world. And I'm reminded of the sacred container that we are called to be for one another, and for those who came before, and those who are here now, and those who are yet to come. So it's not always easy. It's not always easy to be with. It's not always easy to talk about. But Unitarian Universalism does help me bring my best to the challenges of today. It gives me courage and hope and faith. It welcomes and makes useful and relevant all of our observations and insights and questions. For all of those who covenant to show up on behalf of something greater than themselves, on behalf of life's interdependent web. And somehow or another, you have found your way here. You are the leaves. And the question now is, are you willing to help grow this tree? I hope so. And I hope we'll be in conversation about that.